Thanks a lot for coming. So I want to talk about the impact of science fiction on rocket science today. And I want to start with this guy, Gaston Bachelard, who's one of my favorite philosophers. Science is formed rather on reverie than experiment. And it takes a good many experiments to dispel the mists of the dream. Now, probably everybody here speaks French and can read it in the original right there. But anyway, reverie is essentially, it means daydreaming. And dreaming takes many forms. It can take many forms, as I probably don't have to explain. For example, one archaic definition of reverie, at least in English, is a fanciful or impractical idea or theory. So the question at play here in my talk is how to make a fanciful or impractical idea or theory less fanciful and less impractical, how to dispel the mists of the dream through experimentation, and that's the story across 2 centuries of the impact of speculative fiction, which wasn't called science fiction until the second half of the 20th century. The impact of speculative fiction on the actual project of climbing out of the Earth's gravity field to space, essentially rocket science. So let's jump to another gray-beard wise man, Russian rocket scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the founding father of astronautics. Quote, "At first we inevitably have an idea, a fantasy, a fairy tale, and then comes scientific calculations. Finally, execution crowns the thought." Now, clearly, this is a similar thought to Bachelard's. Tsiolkovsky lived in Kaluga, 200 kilometers southwest of Moscow, a provincial Russian town and a provincial Russian savant who wrote both what we now call science fiction and also truly revolutionary scientific papers. The first played the role of fantasy, and the second provided the very important scientific calculations that led to space flight. So for Tsiolkovsky, ideas, fantasies, and fairy tales meant meditating on possibilities, after which came the calculations. Concerning the first, he was very influenced by Jules Verne, the French author, obviously, of speculative fiction, who was incredibly popular in Russia in the late 19th century. His books were well translated, and millions of them sold. And on the right is the cover of the English language edition of the 1865 novel From the Earth to the Moon. While he was still young, quite young, Tsiolkovsky read Verne's 2 novels about a lunar voyage by Verne, and the prospect of spaceflight captured his imagination. But he realized that Jules Verne's lunar voyagers, which he depicted blasting to the moon in a cannon shell, by the way, fired prophetically from Florida, would have turned into tomato juice at the moment of the explosion that launched their shell towards the moon. The muzzle velocity required to go anywhere near such a trajectory was simply far too great, and Tsiolkovsky realized that. But he was also intrigued that Verne had his cannon shell spacecraft maneuvering with rockets as it neared the moon. And that was in his second novel, Around the Moon, published in 1869. And Tsiolkovsky was also impressed that Verne had more or less correctly calculated the velocity necessary to leave Earth, to break free of Earth and head for the moon as 12,000 yards per second. And all of this set him thinking how to improve on Verne's ideas. In other words, the combination of Jules Verne's prior calculations, both realistic and unrealistic, combined with the compelling qualities of the novel, the story, the narrative, provoked his imagination. He was working in almost total poverty in provincial Kaluga with zero state support. Tsiolkovsky sought a credible alternative to a cannon shell for spaceflight. And he came to the idea that chemically fueled rockets, and here is where we connect to the theme of this conference, energy, how to control energy, how to release energy, how to profitably use energy for exploration, many other things. Tsiolkovsky hit upon the idea that chemically fueled rockets could produce an acceleration sufficiently incremental to keep his space travelers from turning into tomato juice, as I said, while achieving escape velocity from Earth. Again, first the fantasy, the fairy tale, then the calculations. And here are some of Tsiolkovsky's calculations. Now, Tsiolkovsky came up with effectively the E equals mc squared of spaceflight. The mathematical formula he produced at the turn of the 20th century was not quite as simple as Einstein's 5 characters, but and eventually he would adapt it he would innovate and create the concept of multi-stage rocketry as well. And that was actually something that he first came up with in a science fiction. Multi-stage rocketry was something he first came up with in a science fiction story that he published before the Russian Revolution. Again, he used science fiction as a kind of scratch pad to work out his ideas. So before anyone else, Tsiolkovsky correctly settled on liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen as ideal propellants, powerful enough to do the job of getting to space. His first such designs saw print in a scientific paper published in 1903, the very same year that the Wright brothers first flew a heavier than air powered aircraft. That's when his most important work, the exploration of cosmic space, by means of reaction devices, was published. And the spacecraft designs he published then, which you can see here, remain the basis for modern spacecraft design. So for example, if you look at this next slide here, setting aside the concept of rocket trains, which was multi-stage rocketry, let's just look at the top stage of his rockets, his rocket design. The pilot and co-pilot were in the first section. The second and third sections held the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen needed to fuel the spacecraft, and the rocket engine was at the tail. And again, he published this in the year of Kitty Hawk and the Wright brothers. Top right, you see the current SpaceX Dragon and Crew Dragon capsule, which is the same principle. And then in the bottom right, the Apollo Command Service Module, which took human beings to the moon for the first time. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, Verne was popular across the whole world, and his Earth to Moon novels were hugely successful. And when he was 11 years old in 1905, a German-speaking citizen of the Habsburg Empire named Hermann Oberth also read From the Earth to the Moon and Around the Moon. That's a quarter of a century after Tsiolkovsky read them. Oberth was 33 years younger than Tsiolkovsky. So working in his native Germanic Transylvania, which is in today's Romania, as well as Munich and Göttingen, Oberth would independently arrive at chemically fueled rocketry and multi-stage rocketry. Over a decade after Tsiolkovsky. He wasn't aware of Tsiolkovsky. Tsiolkovsky published, obviously, in Russian in very obscure journals. There was the language barrier, and there was the fact that even in Russia, Tsiolkovsky wasn't well known. He was well outside of the mainstream of the Russian scientific world. Like Tsiolkovsky's entire body of work on rocketry, Oberth's was mostly theoretical, but he was very interested in moving from theory to practice. Okay, that brings us to the American in the story. That's a young Robert Goddard. Of the 3 great forefathers of spaceflight, he would be the most successful in putting theories into practice. Just prior to the turn of the century, this precocious Massachusetts boy, Robert Goddard, read another early work of science fiction. It was 1898, and he was 16. So he was born in between Tsiolkovsky, who was the oldest, and Oberth, who was the youngest. The novel he read was by English author and futurist H.G. Wells, whose novel, The War of the Worlds, had been published in that year, 1898. The novel was one of the first early science fiction stories to depict an interplanetary conflict between an alien race and human beings. I've been watching The Three-Body Problem over the last week, which is only the latest iteration of this interplanetary, or in this case, interstellar invasion of aliens. In the Jules Verne novel, once again, we have a cannon shell as the means of transportation. In this case, you can see it being launched from the Mars towards Earth. And, spoiler alert, all kinds of bad things happen on Earth when the cannon shells landed, but I will leave that to your imagination. Anyway, what's important here is that this novel captured the imagination of a very young Robert Goddard, and by the fall of 1898, he had realized that it would be an amazing and worthwhile thing if he himself came up with a formula, a technology, a pathway, an ability to travel the opposite direction from in the novel, to go from Earth to Mars. And at the age of 16, he had already decided on his life's vocation. He had found his calling. So like Tsiolkovsky and Oberth, Goddard also arrived independently to the idea of liquid-fueled rocketry as the way to achieve this goal. In 1912, a decade after Tsiolkovsky had, admittedly, he produced his own set of equations to prove that this was possible. But unlike Tsiolkovsky, and a decade before Hermann Oberth in Germany, Goddard actually set about building a series of rockets. By 1919, he had published his groundbreaking work, which you can see on the left, a method of achieving extreme altitudes, which he published with the support of the Smithsonian Institution. He had some levels of support, certainly a lot more than Tsiolkovsky. That was 16 years after Tsiolkovsky's book, but again, unlike the Russian, Goddard was already deep into building and flying a series of powder-fueled rockets. And by 1926, he had built the first liquid-fueled one, which you can see on the right. And then there it is in actuality. So Robert Goddard, the American rocketry pioneer, conducted the first successful liquid-fueled rocket flight test on March 16th, 1926. So meanwhile, the rise in enthusiasm for spaceflight based on, science fiction, and in Germany there was something which I'm going to skip over called the rocketry craze of the 1920s, where there were a lot of rocket-powered cars and deaths, and Opel was involved in building these rocket-powered race cars. It led to an important new phase in which science fiction, again, in effect, cross-pollinated with rocket science, the emerging rocket science. And one result was the first big-budget feature film to depict a lunar voyage, Fritz Lang's 1929 silent film, Woman in the Moon, produced by Germany's largest production company, UFA Studios, something like the MGM of Germany. Now, Fritz Lang was, of course, among the major German directors of his day, and he was looking up to follow the film that we remember him by, the dystopian science fiction masterpiece Metropolis, a kind of proto-Blade Runner. That was from 1927, and he settled on a novel about a lunar voyage as the basis, and he approached Hermann Oberth, who I already had some slides up about, to serve as the scientific technical advisor. Now, Oberth had published a couple well-received and widely reviewed books on travel, space travel, and received quite some attention. So it was a logical thing for Lang to approach Oberth. Oberth took the job, that's Oberth on the left, obviously, but his overriding goal was to turn his spaceflight theories into practice. So he proposed to Fritz Lang, the famous director, that Lang use some of his generous UFA film studio's budget to fund an experimental liquid-fueled rocket to be launched as a PR, public relations, publicity stunt for the film's premiere. And the director was intrigued, and he even put in some of his own money. So here's Oberth in the workshop provided for him on the grounds of the film studio itself. Now, unfortunately, Oberth's engineering wasn't as advanced as his theoretical expertise, and during a test firing of his experimental rocket in the summer of 1929, his prototype rocket blew up in his face. The explosion ruptured Oberth's eardrum and almost cost him his left eye. Completely humiliated by this, he fled back home to his native Transylvania to recover and to avoid the premiere at all costs. So even without an actual rocket launch, Woman in the Moon proved to be a significant popularizer of the possibility of human space travel. Under Hermann Oberth's direct influence, the film marked the first time that multi-stage rocketry was relatively convincingly shown on the screen, as convincingly as visual effects could produce at that period. Various other details, by the way, served as direct harbingers of the actual Cold War space race 3 decades later. For example, the countdown, which we are so familiar with, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, liftoff, was a Fritz Lang innovation in a silent movie in order to heighten the tension and excitement prior to launch. He came up with that as intertitles, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then boom, the model rocket took off, and then NASA adopted that later. So that itself came from a film. Okay, so following the premiere of Woman in the Moon, with their leading engineer still recovering from his wounds at home in Transylvania, members of Germany's Society for Space Travel, which Hermann Oberth was a founding member of, requested that UFA Film Studios give them the materials that Oberth had produced in a workshop in the UFA Film Studios grounds, funded by UFA, and then they proceeded to use those materials as the basis for an improved rocket engine that they called Minimum Rakete, or Mirak. And you can see it here in a static firing test. In effect, they figured out how to use Hermann Oberth's thrust chamber, and they modified his conical motor, and they achieved better results. It didn't blow up. They learned from his mistakes. Now, one of the young rocket scientists working with Oberth in the Society for Spaceflight was a young engineer from an upper-class family, Werner von Braun. And you can see him there on the right behind the guy with the white coat, and standing next to the rocket there, the Mirak, was Oberth, back from Transylvania, all patched up. The Mirak series of rockets ultimately flew over 100 times between 1931 and 1932, frequently with von Braun's participation and Oberth's supervision. By the time the Second World War broke out in 1939 with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, von Braun had joined a secret military rocketry program which further developed the Mirak series of rockets into another series of rockets collectively designated Aggregat, and it was the Aggregat 4, also known as the V2, which became the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Its first flight was in 1942. Again, this was a direct technological descendant from the Mirak rockets that had been gradually modified from Hermann Oberth's rocket engine funded by a film studio. Science fiction film budget. 2 months later than what? Oh, no, 2 years later, excuse me, 2 years after the first flight of the V-2, in June of 1944, only 11 months before the end of the Second World War in Europe, a V-2 test fired directly upwards reached an altitude of 108.5 miles before falling back to Earth. According to one widely respected metric, space begins at 62 miles above sea level, so the V-2 became the first human-made object to reach space, even if it didn't have the power to go into orbit. And on the right is a replica. On the right is a replica of the V-2 that made it to space at the Technical Museum in Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea, which is where they test fired these things. I'm not trying to negate or reduce any individual's war guilt, least of all Wernher von Braun's. But what conceivable justification could there be in a Third Reich facing imminent defeat to test fire an expensive V-2 directly upwards to see if it could reach space, effectively wasting it? And in case there was any doubt about its designer's ambitions, and in case there was any doubt about the lineage of the rocket engine inside, the V-2 that reached space had the distinctive logo of Fritz Lang's Woman in the Moon painted between its fins right over the rocket engine. You see? Of course, the V-2 had another purpose. It killed more than 4,000 civilians in London and Antwerp by the end of the war. This is a London impact site. But the V-2 killed far more people during its production, with an estimated 20,000 worker slaves dying in the, effectively a concentration camp dug into the mountain at Mittelbau Dora, where they produced the V-2 in the squalid subterranean production lines. At the fall of the Third Reich in 1945, Wernher von Braun surrendered to the Americans. He and his most important fellow engineers were brought to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip with very few questions about wartime guilt asked. And they proceeded to conduct a series of V-2 tests for the U.S. Army in New Mexico. You can see one of them there. So I've been skipping the Soviet side of this story because this is a half-hour talk. But the Soviets also acquired V-2 missiles, rockets, and learned from them. And in 1957, the Soviet Union lofted the first satellite, you can see on the left, Sputnik, and with the first human being in space following 4 years later, April 12, 1961, when they launched 27-year-old cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin on a single Earth orbit. Both Sputnik and Gagarin rode R-7 rockets designed according to principles first articulated half a century before by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, namely rocket trains, multi-stage, liquid-fueled rocketry, and built according to some engineering innovations by Robert Goddard and a lot of others from the German V-2 program. Von Braun, meanwhile, had designed the Redstone rocket for the U.S. Army, and the U.S. followed Yuri Gagarin's orbit on May 7th, only about 3 weeks after Gagarin, by launching astronaut Alan Shepard, American astronaut Alan Shepard, on a modified version of the Redstone missile that von Braun had designed for the U.S. Army. Because it was a smaller rocket, not an intercontinental ballistic missile like the R-7 that Gagarin had rode to orbit, Shepard's flight was suborbital. It lasted only 15 minutes. But following President John F. Kennedy's address to the U.S. Congress that same month, May 1961, in which the U.S. president declared the American goal to land human beings on the moon, by the end of the decade, far bigger rockets were soon under development. And you can see here von Braun, he's no longer a teenager, below the 5 giant engine bells of his greatest achievement, the Saturn V moon rocket. In 1968, an eerie echo of Fritz Lang's Woman in the Moon, which you see on the left, still unfolded as the Apollo 8 capsule was brought out of its hangar to be mounted on top of the Saturn V. That was for the first circumnavigation of the moon by human beings, which took place that December when human beings witnessed Earth rising over the surface of the moon for the first time. And the following year, July 16th, 1969, Apollo 11 was launched, followed by the first landing on Earth's natural satellite on July 20th, 1969, serving as a kind of ultimate realization of the vision of spaceflight articulated in the first big-budget feature film to depict spaceflight with reasonable accuracy. A film which had funded Hermann Oberth's initial rocketry research, which in turn led to the V2. Then to Wernher von Braun's Redstone rocket, and ultimately to the Saturn V moon rocket. The mighty Saturn V rocket remains the only one to have transported human beings beyond Earth orbit to this day. We are nearing a time when that's going to happen again, but we haven't yet gotten there. Fulfilling the goals of Tsiolkovsky, Oberth, and Goddard. As for Oberth's 6-foot-long liquid-fueled rocket, developed in 1929 from the budget of Fritz Lang's science fiction film, Woman in the Moon, it was a kind of an acorn to the 363-foot-tall Saturn V Oak, directly linking the first big-budget sci-fi movie to depict spaceflight in a believable fashion to the actual lunar voyage that took place 4 decades later. So just to take that story to the present day, here's a kind of visual riff concerning the impact that science fiction can have on actual rocket science. At the top is a still from Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke's 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey, complete with sophisticated flat panel screen displays in the cockpit in the top image, with computer graphics and all that stuff. And that was all produced with 16mm projectors underneath the set because they didn't have anything like that technology at the time. And below it is the interior of the SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule, currently being used regularly to transport crews to the International Space Station. And this takes me back to this kind of good-natured, bearded philosopher here, Gaston Bachelard. Science is formed rather on reverie than on experiment, and it takes a good many experiments to dispel the mists of the dream. And that is my talk. I'll be happy to discuss it or answer any questions. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk. Sorry, I'm Martin Chick from Edinburgh. What's very striking about the talk is, actually how the technology, in a sense, doesn't change. So you've still got liquid fuels, you've still got the same shaped rockets, which, given the pace of technological change over the past 100 years, is quite paradoxical that we're still doing stuff in the old way. And the second question I had was that in the middle of the period, I suppose the middle third of the 20th century, the defense use of rocketry is clearly to the fore. You've mentioned the V1s, the V2s. When you're looking at the nice bearded dreamers of the past, or H.G. Wells or Verne, do they also discuss the use of this new technology for defense security reasons? Thank you.
So let me address each in turn. I would even say that the visions of sci-fi, of space exploration in science fiction in the mid-20th century might end up being a limiting factor in contemporary spaceflight. For example, if you look at Chesley Bonestell's mid-20th century depictions of rockets landing on the moon, you have this tall, unwheeled, phallic, let's say it, object with fins landing on the moon. And in those paintings, you have a table flat moon because that's what's required to land something like that on the moon. And of course, we saw the lunar lander in the late 60s, early 70s had a much lower shape with wide legs outstretched because the lunar surface is very irregular, and that was safer. And just Okay, okay, my point here, though, is that Elon Musk is thoroughly influenced by mid-century science fiction. He wanted his spacesuits to look super cool. He wanted everything to look as slick as in the science fiction movies that he loves. You know, that's all great. That's what I'm talking about here. But having a tall, unstable rocket landing tail first on the surface of the moon. We'll see if this works, but I'm a little bit skeptical. And one reason I'm skeptical is just a few weeks ago, a NASA-funded, privately designed lunar lander, robotic lander, with a kind of a phone booth shape, very tall, with small legs below, tried to land and fell right over, you know. So that's to answer your first question about, you know, the way in which sci-fi, well, I don't remember exactly what you were asking me, but I think that pretty much answers what you asked me. Now, the second question about military applications. H.G. Wells was kind of the 19th century prognosticator of vast wars using these types of technologies. Jules Verne a little bit less, but again, they had cannon shells, for God's sake, as space vehicles. So there's no doubt that one of my favorite quotes is from the great German philosopher, whose name, of course, is now escaping me. I have him in a slide. Well, let me find it. One of my favorite quotes. First, I'll quote him, then I'll get his name, which I'm embarrassed that I don't remember. There is no artifact of human civilization that is not also an artifact of barbarism. No, not Nietzsche. I'll tell you. And it's ridiculous that I don't remember it because he's so... Walter Benjamin. German Jewish philosopher. Yeah. There is no document of human civilization that is not also a document of barbarism. I think that applies to space technologies almost better than anything else. Yeah. Well, many other things too. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you for your questions, by the way.